Singapore is small. It is in fact so small that it measures only 50 kilometers east to west and 42 kilometers north to south. Despite its small size, however, Singapore has a highly developed economy and is known for its vibrant culture, world-class food, cleanliness, safety, and stunning architecture. It also has a population of over 5.8 million people, making it one of the most densely populated countries in the world. But Singapore wasn't always like this. The island nation was once a low-income country with a small, poorly educated population plagued by poverty and social unrest. Two-thirds of Singapore's population lived in squalid slums, unemployment was high, and there was no significant industry to speak of. Singapore also had no access to natural resources and was cut off from trade by its larger, more powerful neighbors who were actively hostile to its very existence. It seemed like Singapore was destined for underdevelopment, violence, and poverty. Fast forward to today, however, and Singapore is one of the most prosperous and technologically advanced countries in the world. Its infrastructure is exceptional, and its citizens are among the most educated, healthy, productive, and wealthy. Singapore's GDP per capita has risen from less than $320 in the 1960s to an incredible $60,000 today. And according to the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, Singapore was the world's most competitive economy in 2022 for the fourth year in a row. So how did this tiny, once poor Asian island nation become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, far surpassing the neighbors that once looked down upon it? Singapore's story begins in the 19th century when the British East India Company dominated global trade. 20% of the entire world's population lived on lands that the EIC owned, and the company made more money than its host nation and even had its own military. It derived its profits from shipping and trading resources from all over the world, the most lucrative of which was Chinese tea. To purchase this tea, the company sold massive quantities of opium, which it grew in northern India. All of this shipping happened to pass through a narrow corridor known as the Malacca Strait. This quickly became the company's most profitable trade route, accounting for 50% of its entire revenue. The company desperately wanted its own port in the region to protect this route and make the voyage more feasible. The Dutch, however, were a naval superpower that controlled the region and overpowered anyone who tried to compete. Fearful of disrupting their incredibly lucrative existing trade routes, the EIC had made it official company policy to not take any actions that might anger the Dutch. A company official called Sir Thomas Raffles, however, took it upon himself to create such a port on the island that would subsequently become Singapore. The port Thomas Raffles built was unlike any existing port in the region. To attract traders away from existing ports in the region, Singapore was turned into a freeport, or a port that placed no taxes on business or port-related activities. This was in stark contrast to the other heavily taxed ports in the region. But the strategy worked, and within 4 years, Singapore had attracted tens of thousands of traders from China, Malaya, and India, while a lack of significant oversight also made Singapore a hub for slave trading, gambling, opium dens, violence, and prostitution. Booming international trade, nevertheless, caused the island to grow in importance and popularity. The opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt provided an added boost by shortening the trade route from England to China by 5,000 miles. This reduced costs and dramatically increased shipping demands. Thanks to its strategic location, Singapore became the most important port in the region and by 1967 had become an official crown colony of the British Empire. The subsequent introduction of rubber trees to Malaya and the booming global demand for tin, which was abundant in the region, turned Singapore into more than just a stop on the way to China, instead making it a hub for the riches of Southeast Asia. Resources from the Malayan Peninsula were processed in Singapore before being shipped globally, and as Singapore had no natural resources of its own, this fostered a symbiotic economic relationship with Malaya. As Singapore's importance grew, British military presence on the island also increased and created an industry surrounding its dockyards that provided services to military personnel. And by 1900, Singapore was home to more than 200,000 people who were much better off than those in surrounding nations. But Singapore's centuries of unhindered growth would soon come to a screeching halt. By the start of 1942, Japan had invaded Malaysia and Singapore. Under Japanese rule, the island underwent unbelievable suffering and destruction, and by 1945, it was no longer the crown jewel of the British Empire. Instead, having transformed into a smoldering pile of rubble, devastated by war and neglected by a crippled British Empire. Slums began to dominate the island, while violence and opium plagued its population. For most of its existence, Singapore had little desire to split from the British Empire, as a lack of resources meant that it was spared from the exploitation that other colonies faced. But faced with miserable conditions after the war, Singaporeans began vying for independence under the charge of a British-educated lawyer called Kuan. Lee spearheaded the independence movement and in 1959 was elected prime minister on the promise of reunited Singapore with Malaya. The economies of the two were symbiotically linked, and Singapore didn't have the capacity to defend itself, so the unification made sense. Lee, in fact, saw it as the only way for Singapore to survive. By 1963, he had succeeded, and the former Malayan colonies of North Borneo, Sarawak, and Singapore merged with Malaya to become the Federation of Malaysia. Subsequent Malaysian elections, however, brought in a party that ruled on the promise of putting ethnic Malays first. This posed a problem for Singapore as it was 60% Chinese and ethnically highly diverse. Massive violence broke out, and Lee's People's Action Party, or PAP, now ran in the federal elections on the promise of a fair and multi-ethnic state. This caused the ruling party to see Singapore as a threat to political, social, and economic stability, and Singapore was once again ejected from Malaya just 2 years after reunification. Lee Kuan Yew faced seemingly insurmountable challenges when he took the helm of the newly independent nation. Singaporeans had no cohesive national identity and few natural resources, while social unrest and poverty were rampant. The departure of the British military further worsened Singapore's economic situation, leaving it vulnerable to exploitation by neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia. Lee, however, was determined to succeed in making Singapore prosper at all costs, and began by quelling the social unrest that threatened to tear the island apart. He cemented the BAP's political power and curtailed individual freedoms, banning free speech and jailing political opponents without trial. Draconian punishments were meted out for even minor offenses, including public caning for chewing gum and drunkenness. Lee believed that an iron fist was necessary to stabilize the nation and prevent violence from erupting, and his approach worked. He also addressed the housing crisis. 70% of Singaporeans were then living in rough, temporary structures, and Lee instituted a controversial law allowing the government to buy land cheaply to construct affordable housing. He also modified the Central Provident Fund, which was originally designed for pensions, to allow citizens to spend it on housing. These policies proved to be massive successes, and 80% of Singaporeans today own the houses that were originally built by the state. With the social and political situation in Singapore now stabilized, Lee set his sights on a dramatic economic overhaul. Lee Kuan Yew was well aware that Singapore had no resources or existing manufacturing, and foreign investment as a result was the only way for Singapore to grow. To attract FDI, he created a business-friendly environment with low taxes and minimal regulation. He banned unions and actively encouraged businesses to fire workers when faced with strikes, and also invested heavily in infrastructure, building up the port, airport, and road systems to make Singapore a hub for international trade. Education and innovation was also prioritized, and Lee created technical schools and paid foreign companies to train workers, resulting in a highly skilled workforce and the growth of industries such as high-tech manufacturing and financial services that paved the way for Singapore's current status as a global financial center. Lee also organized a group of civil servants and international businessmen to create state-owned companies, including Singapore Airlines and steel, iron, and chemical manufacturing plants. While in most other countries, state-owned enterprises are loss-making ventures, in Singapore, these companies were wildly successful due to low corruption, Lee's willingness to shut down loss-making ventures, and the lack of labor unions, which kept costs low. The wealth created was placed in a sovereign wealth fund, which was used to further funding for healthcare, infrastructure, and education. If you've enjoyed this video so far, please like it and subscribe to our channel. It's free for you to do, but supports our team more than you know. Now back to the video. Under Lee's leadership, Singapore underwent a remarkable economic transformation from a struggling post-colonial nation to a global economic powerhouse within the span of just a few decades. Today, Singapore is known for its financial sector, petrochemicals, and advanced computer components. It boasts the second largest port, is the second easiest nation to do business in, and attracts the third highest level of FDI. Its citizens enjoy affordable housing and access to world-class education and healthcare. While Singapore's location on one of the world's most crucial shipping lanes and the rise of globalization were lucky breaks, the island's most significant stroke of luck was a visionary leader. Lee's authoritarian approach to governance may yield criticism, but there is no denying his outstanding legacy.